Now, net zero, don't switch off, bogeyman, or essential part of our future. We know that it infuriates and it frustrates in equal measure. Should we all have electric cars? Should I buy a heat pump? Why are wind farms blighting the countryside? But is there a way to make a conservative argument for tackling climate change? Well, we are going to give it a go, starting with someone who really hates net zero. Welcome to the Daily Tea with me, Kamal Ahmed. So I was at Conservative Party conference earlier this week with Tim Stanley, my colleague and sketch writer for The Telegraph, and we interviewed Tory royalty, Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg. And everything was going really well about the future of the Conservatives and what they needed to do to make sure that people wanted to vote for them in the next election, when this happened.
We may have global warming, which will lead to more variations in climate, and then we adapt. And we work out how we deal with what is happening. We may start growing more champagne in Sussex, and we may find that other bits of the world become more productive, others less productive. But if all of us switched off our central heating, sent our cars to the crushers, wore the same clothes for the next 30 years, it would not make a blind bit of difference to emissions. We're 1% of emissions.
Net zero has frankly become one of those big dividing issues, monopolised by one side of the political debate. People who question net zero policies are sometimes aligned with people who deny that climate change even matters. But Labour's environmental plans, boy, are they controversial. They want much more offshore wind, which is going to need more connectors to the coast, more building on the coast, more pylons running across our green and pleasant land. They've been refusing North Sea oil and gas contracts, which has put at risk tens of thousands of jobs in Scotland and in the North Sea. And they want to launch this new, what they're calling a state-owned energy company, but actually it doesn't make or produce energy. It's actually an investment vehicle for putting money into new investment projects. It all sounds a bit like it's out of the big state playbook. But for the Conservatives, who are now often seemingly shouting against net zero, they've also been on a bit of a journey. Let's take ourselves right back to 2006 and this bloke talking about climate change.
And if you want to improve your environment, if you want to have better parks and public spaces, cleaner streets, more recycling, those are my priorities. Those are the priorities of the Conservative Party. And so remember, if you vote blue, you can go green.
So that was a very young David Cameron talking in the local election campaigns of 2006. Of course, it was only 4 years later that he became the Prime Minister and was in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, certainly a very pro-environmental action party, and David Cameron promised to run the most green government ever. 2013 though, and things had started to change. There were real worries about our energy bills, which were going up, and there was that big news story which you might remember. David Cameron was quoted, it was time to get rid of all this green crap. There was lots of internal arguments about whether we should have fracking and whether there should be green levies, taxes on businesses that polluted. But the Tories were still trying to play with this idea that David Cameron had introduced with George Osborne in opposition, which was vote blue and go green, because the public really supported more efforts and policy change on climate change. And it was actually Theresa May, who of course followed David Cameron, who had quit after losing the Brexit referendum, who enshrined net zero by 2050 into law.
Some people think that you can either have low emissions or economic growth. That's not the case. Actually, what we've shown already is that you can lower emissions, and we have this net zero target, and have economic growth at the same time.
And then after Theresa May came booster Boris Johnson. And boy, of course, a bit of a shopping trolley at times on all sorts of issues, whether that's COVID, whether that's Brexit, but certainly on climate. And he certainly, although he expressed some scepticism about climate change policies, he actually also pledged to do a huge amount.
We want to turn the UK into the Saudi Arabia of wind power generation, enough wind power by 2030 to supply every single one of our homes with electricity. We're going ahead with massive solar programs, even though we can't hope to emulate the incredible things being done by India or Australia or Morocco, for instance. Hydro, of course, we're going ahead with liberating the awesome potential of hydrogen, whether for homes or all sorts of other uses. On electric vehicles, we're going to ban ICEs, internal combustion engines, new internal combustion engines by 2030 with a very ambitious program. We'll continue to develop new nuclear power.
But problems over delivery of new nuclear, for example, and actually getting these green policies through started really changing the Conservative mood music around green policies. Rishi Sunak dropped an £11.6 billion climate pledge and did give the green light for new oil and gas projects. It seemed that the language of David Cameron and George Osborne and Theresa May was coming to an end. And then there was a new group of MPs really wedded to the arguments against net zero, who called themselves the Net Zero Scrutiny Group. They were concerned about the impact of climate policies, particularly on the economy, and we had rising prices because of the invasion of Ukraine, cost of living, inflation. Suddenly all those green issues seemed far less important. The Conservatives promised to scrap the ultra-low emission zones in London, said they would build new power stations and cut the costs of climate change. It seemed that David Cameron's pledge to cut the crap had actually come true. But climate change still really matters to voters, and lots of them are Conservative voters. We've often spoken on this podcast about a quiet environmentalism, often very much part of the Conservative offer. Protect our green and pleasant land, and that's often been lost in how we discuss climate change. We were wondering on the Daily Tea team whether there was a middle way. Is there a way of resurrecting the conversation of net zero, but not getting the backup of Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg? After the break, two experts in this area will try and create a different type of argument, a Conservative argument for tackling climate change. Welcome back. Time now for those two experts. One is John Penrose, former Conservative MP for Weston-super-Mare and author of a new report for the Centre for Policy Studies, of course Margaret Thatcher's favourite think tank, called A Cheaper Route to Net Zero, and also Emma Pinchbeck. She's the Chief Executive of Energy UK, which represents some of the biggest energy providers in the country. I started by asking them, why had net zero become so toxic? So, John Penrose, tell us, let's start at the first point for our audience, which is, why do we even need net zero? That seems to be a rather dim question, but let me just sort of try and explain it a little bit. The net zero debate has become a political argument. Doesn't mean that climate change is being denied or that people don't think climate change is happening, but the way it has been formulated as a political project, as net zero, has become a problem for many, many people. Just start there. Why has net zero become such a toxic word?
I think that's absolutely the right place to start, because people are saying, well, hang on a second, even if people are willing to accept that climate change is a thing and is a problem, what does that mean? I've got to throw out my boiler or change and drive a car I don't want to drive, which might run out of gas, run out of charge halfway up the M4. So I think the answer which the centre-right ought to be looking for is to say there are better answers to this. There are better ways of doing it which are more free market, which are cheaper for you and me and your listeners and your viewers, and actually will be a great deal better for our economy too. And if we do it that way around, with consent, with people saying, actually, I can end up with cheaper energy bills as a result of this, then all of a sudden you start getting people saying, hang on a sec, that makes sense from my family's point of view, that makes sense from my lifestyle's point of view, and we're all struggling with high energy bills at the moment. If you can cut those for me, then at that point, that could be a real sweet spot for the Conservative Party to operate in.
But how, John, people might be saying, they remember back to David Cameron vote blue, go green. They remember Boris Johnson, big proponent of environmental change and the whole agenda about climate change and tackling climate change. You had 14 years. How did we get into this mess? Why weren't you making those types of arguments you've just said to me over the last 14 years?
Well, I was, but unfortunately, I have not yet persuaded everybody about the size of them. The point about it, though, now is that we've had actually not just 14 years, because quite a lot of what we do at the moment was set by Tony Blair in something called the Climate Change Act way back when. So it's more than 14 years, and as Churchill said about the Americans, they can usually be relied on to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. We've tried everything else, it's not working, it's really ruffling people's feathers, it's upsetting people a lot. The chance now is to do it the right way, and if we do it in a sort of small state way, we can still achieve net zero, but we can do it with much, much lower energy bills than we will otherwise be facing.
Now, you've written a report on it, and we're going to come back to that in a couple of minutes. Emma, bring us up to date from the energy companies' side. Have you been surprised how toxic a political and almost cultural debate net zero has become? Do we need a new language?
Yeah, I think it's a good point that somehow the way we're explaining this to the public is not always cutting through. And I'm not sure if I asked people in the pub what net zero was, they'd actually be able to give me the answer. I think it's become this thing that we bandy around. In the energy sector, I very rarely use the term net zero because what I'm talking about is an energy transition which is gathering pace regardless of what you think about climate change. And it is the deployment of technologies of a new energy age. Electric vehicles, electric heating technologies, renewables, batteries. These are technologies which the market wants to deploy because they can see an economic opportunity from them. There are then technologies that we're trying to abate because we understand that they've got negative externalities, and the economists speak, but pollution costs the economy money, and or because we care about climate change. But this economic argument, this industrial argument, this new energy age argument is one the public generally agrees with. As soon as you describe that as being about net zero, you get a different response. And I have to say, in the 5 years I've been doing this job, I've never had a politician kick me out of their office if I'm saying I want to add 240 billion quid to the UK economy, please. I think if I went in and said, I want to talk to you about climate change, I sometimes have a different reception.
And just explain to us what net zero is. That would be tremendously helpful.
So we are trying to reduce our emissions against 1990 base levels of emissions down to net zero levels in the economy. That doesn't mean absolute zero. It means we'll go as far as we can to remove GHG emissions from the economy.
What are those?
They are
greenhouse gases.
Greenhouse gases.
Yeah,
thank you. I was going to list them all for you, but the main one, the main one in energy that we worry about is carbon, because we produce carbon when we burn things, and the netting bit is there is a bit of the economy that's very hard to completely decarbonise, and the idea is that you will net those emissions off with another kind of technology. That, I think, is quite complicated for people to grasp.
Just following that here.
And it tightened up from an 80% reduction before Theresa May's Net Zero Act. It doesn't mean 100% removing emissions, it doesn't mean even doing it before 2030, it's over the next decades, and the idea is we work through every stage of the economy in order, starting with the easy stuff in power and working our way through to things that are quite difficult, like steel or manufacturing.
If I'm sceptical, Emma, about, and I hear the word net zero and I just hear that's more taxes for me, as you say, John, that's going to mean me throwing out my boiler, having to get a new car, all expense. We saw the reaction around traffic management under what's called ULEZ, particularly in London, in the Uxbridge by-election. That really showed a reaction from the public. How do you explain to a more sceptical audience what this brings? And I think we were talking at dinner, weren't we, Emma? We were at an official dinner last night, we were talking about this. There's some connection with what I describe as quiet environmentalism of the Conservative Party, which is about protecting the landscape, about conserving the core principle of conservatism.
Yeah.
This green and pleasant land.
Yeah.
And also intergenerational. We worry about our children. Is there a way that you can tackle that scepticism with slightly more emotional arguments, if that's fair?
So there are two frames I think really work for most people, and particularly the centre-right, and we've covered one of those already, which is the vast economic opportunity of doing this, the energy security opportunity. If you think about China or the US or Europe investing in these technologies now faster than we are, that works. I think particularly the idea of British exceptionalism, technologies we can lead the world in, that sort of heritage of having led the last industrial revolution, that I have found very effective for most people. But the other frame, and I'd love to work out how to get this to a broader audience. I come from a very beautiful part of the world. I'm entirely in this job because emotionally I care about that landscape. It is the landscape that my grandmother's brothers farmed. 14 generations of my family are from there. I've gone home and I'm raising my children there.
Where is that?
It's in Stroud in Gloucestershire and the kind of surrounding land. It's an area of outstanding natural beauty. I know because of my work that climate change is one of the biggest threats to that landscape. It's already providing huge challenges to our farmers with increased flooding. We're seeing insect populations plummeting. The landscape has changed in my memory in my lifetime, and as a mother I find that devastating when I think about what I'm handing on to my children. To tackle climate change, I understand I need to build more infrastructure. I need to squeeze fossil fuels out of the economy, and that might mean one day putting a wind farm or a pylon on that landscape. And there are pylons on the hill over from my house. My 2-year-old son thinks they're beautiful because he's never known anything differently. And I love that because when I look at him looking at the pylons in that landscape that my grandmother's family farmed, there is that thread of inheritance and of a value about natural conservatism, which I think we need to articulate much better in the fight that we've got to come.
You see, immediately I'm emotionally with you.
Absolutely.
In a way that I'm not if you start throwing numbers at me and also telling me to do things. You've written a lot about this.
Yeah.
What are your, just building a little bit on what Emma's then there outlined, how do we make this conversation more positive for the public, given the work you have done?
So firstly we need to engage the emotion, as we've just heard, because everybody has got a favourite view. Even if you live in the middle of a city, you'll have a favourite view in your local park or whatever it might be. And everybody understands that if you concrete all over it, it's gone forever, and we need to preserve these things. And most Brits are, as I think you called it, a quiet environmentalist. And just look at the way that we've all started, doing our recycling. Whereas 10 years ago, that was kind of a weird thing. Now everybody does it as a normal thing. So we're up for it as a nation. We totally are. But we don't want it to be bossing us around and telling us that we've got to sell our perfectly good car, replace our perfectly good boiler, etc., etc. We want to do it in a way which works for us, and ideally does it with cheaper energy at the same time. And there's a couple of things that we could be doing differently. One of it is just simply that we need to rewire the way our energy markets work, because at the moment they are all driven off the international gas prices. The trouble with international gas prices is they bear no relationship whatsoever to the costs of running a wind farm, or the costs of running, building a battery farm, or the costs of building a solar array. And actually what that means is that the price of our bills are going up and down all over the place all the time. Every time they announce the new price cap every 3 months, it goes up and it goes down. The prices of a wind farm haven't changed very much at all. And that means that those wind farm owners are either making out like bandits, or alternatively really, really suffering, depending on what gas is doing. That's just bonkers. And if we rewire the way
why are we connected to the gas price? Why is that so significant? Is that just the way we sorted things out in the 1970s?
It's kind of a historical.
Assuming,
It's a historical hangover. There are some other reasons about the fact that gas is the kind of the thing that you go to if the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. So it still will have a role, but it could be an awful lot smaller. And therefore the point is, if we rewire the way our markets work to reflect reality, to reflect the fact that we've got more and more renewables coming on stream, actually you could end up with a very different kind of market, one that's potentially very much cheaper. But you've also got to allow for the fact that we don't want to have to build loads and loads more insurance policy gas plants to cope with the days when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. At the moment we are all over the place on that. We aren't coping with that properly. We aren't factoring those costs in. We factor those costs in and then say, right now, how do we do this cleverly? That can make a huge difference, and that will end up with lower bills in the long run.
Emma, I've seen report after report after report that the last government and this new government we are never going to hit 2050 to be net zero. There just isn't the infrastructure there. There isn't the take-up of the technologies we need to take up as consumers, but also as businesses. It seems quite a bleak landscape, which can leave people thinking, well, why should I make all the effort, spend all this money? It's quite similar to the idea that the UK produces 2% of emissions. Why are we so bothered in this country, given that 98% of emissions come from elsewhere? So just on the first point, it can sound a bit depressing for us as a country to hear we're never going to hit these targets.
We're off track.
Yeah.
What would I say about that? I'm going to echo John's point, which is to do some. The good news is, unlike 10 years ago when I started my career, this doesn't have to be an agenda pushed by the state for climate change reasons onto a market that isn't up for it. I represent all energy technologies for cross-market and cross-system, and we can see the opportunity of electrification regardless of climate change, and the industry is absolutely desperate to make clear to consumers how cheap renewables can be for them. We would like to offer them new tariffs and services for their heat pumps, for their electric vehicles. We'd like to offer them the financing to make those technologies accessible. We fundamentally believe that this is the direction of the private market. The reason we haven't been able to do that is often regulatory. It's often policy in the way. It's planning reform. I'm sure you've heard planning reform at every party at the conference. There is a reason for that. The consent for a new nuclear site for just the environmental assessment is 40 times longer than the complete works of Shakespeare. It takes us 15 years to get a grid connection. We cannot easily offer really dynamic, interesting tariffs to people with electric vehicles without them being loss leading often for the market. We cannot get batteries in the right place on the system. We can't unlock smart data models or smart tariffs for your heat pump. We can't offer financing for your heat pump. We can't even install them because of planning permission. So I think there is a lot of reason for hope because these technologies are available and the market wants to do them. And there's a lot of reason for hope because a lot of the stuff in our way is regulatory and policy stuff. And don't we all like cutting red tape?
Absolutely. We've been hearing that today. Go on, John.
I just want to pick up on that because that is the other bit for the Conservative Party and the centre-right. The opportunity to have a proper bonfire of red tape. People talk about this all the time. And where is it? And this is one of the areas where we can make a huge difference because if we get these couple of rewirings right, we can basically get rid of loads and loads of old-fashioned, clunky old rules. And at that point, we free up enormous chunks of our economy. It's properly conservative free market stuff. It's sitting there. Thatcher would have been proud of supply-side reforms, and we haven't done it, and we should.
Now, John, you used to be an MP. Emma's spoken about her 2-year-old's love for a pylon near the house. Now, that's lovely to hear, Emma. Are we sure that...
I haven't brainwashed him at all.
No. That lots of people living in communities around the UK are going to be happy to see, as Keir Starmer demanded in his conference speech last week, more pylons, more onshore wind. When you cross the border from England to Scotland...
I'm getting political neuralgia, just
when
as
you
talk
cross
about
the border from England to Scotland and you see there have been far more wind farms, onshore wind farms built in Scotland than in England, that change in landscape, I must admit, I really notice, and I'm not thinking, great, bring it on. I want to see many more of these humming white.
Some do, but lots don't. Absolutely.
So what do we do as a former politician? How do we get more people to be thinking like Emma's 2-year-old? Maybe that's not quite right, but you know what I mean.
so the answer is not to force them and tell them and say you've got to have it because I say so. That's a disaster. It doesn't have any democratic consent. Is guaranteed to get people marching in the streets or in the lanes or in the fields to stop it. The answer, I think, is to say, look, if somebody wants to build a wind farm over there in your, within sight of your front room, what will they offer you? Will they offer you a 10-year discount on your energy bill? Will they, those sorts of things? Now, at that point, I may think yes, I may think no, but at that point, it isn't just you've got to have it and tough. It's a proper conversation, and you might actually create democratic consent by saying we can do you a deal here, because we need you to accept this, but here's something which, and it might not be a discount on your energy bills, it could be something else. But either way, it's a proper conversation of people getting to proper consent rather than just being told and forced.
Will you admit, John, that the Conservatives had 14 years to formulate this argument, and you're now talking to me after a huge defeat for the Conservatives? You've got a bit of an apology to make, haven't you, to the public, that you're telling me now what you should do, and you've been in government for 14 years.
As I said, I've been trying to argue this for years.
Why weren't your colleagues?
Why
Why weren't your colleagues? If your colleagues are conservative, why were they not understanding this argument?
So some of it as well is because, to begin with, we were in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and then there were one or two other things that sort of took up the airspace, like Brexit and then a pandemic. And as a result, I think that what we ended up was taking our eye off the ball. And the stuff which people expect from a conservative government, which is supply side reforms, making things work better, we haven't been doing those for 5 or 6 years when we probably should have been. And as a result, people said, well, why doesn't it work properly? Why does too much of it not flipping well work? And that's one of the reasons they got fed up.
We're not hearing a huge amount of talk, are we, from the Conservative leadership campaigners? We're hearing a lot about immigration. We're hearing a lot about cultural issues. We're hearing hardly anything about the climate. That must worry you.
So what we are hearing from all 4 of the remaining candidates is talk about a small state, which actually is what we're talking about here with this deregulation stuff we were just mentioning. What we haven't seen so far is saying, well, how do you do that? How do you deliver it? And I think one of the opportunities here is to say, if you want to know how to deliver a small state and create one, here's a really good example. It's an absolutely crashingly, a straightforward one. The ball's at your feet. The net is open in front of you. Slot it between the posts.
Now, Emma, obviously, your organisation is apolitical. Need to make that clear. What hope do you have that you can have a new type of conversation with Labour? A lot of people criticise Labour for being very top-down, that they will order people to do things, that this will be all about state intervention, and frankly, a lot of people are going to respond negatively to that.
We can do the good and the bad. So the nature of energy is an essential service to the economy and to many businesses, and therefore I find it unlikely that we would ever move away from a model which is essentially a partnership between government and the sector, where government sets the parameters within which they want us to work. One of those is decarbonise. Another one is make sure energy is as affordable as possible, target these vulnerable groups and so on. What you tend to get with a change of government is a sort of difference in flavour about where the emphasis is. I'd say good things that the new government is doing. The ambition is good, the bullishness is good. We are competing for a lot of investment that went over to the US because of the Inflation Reduction Act.
Did we lose investment, do you think, in this country?
There was a point where there was a lot of conversation about net zero being bad for the economy, or scepticism about net zero in the press, where I was getting nervous calls from investors, and someone told me they were losing £50 million a week of investment from the UK while all of that was happening, over to the US, which had introduced this programme of quite ambitious tax credits under the Inflation Reduction Act. We've got competition from Europe. China is by far the biggest clean tech investor in the world. So I think in terms of going into government and making the case for investment, the ambition is welcome. The other thing that's welcome from them is we do need a little bit of the state. And one thing I'd say about wind turbines and pylons is if we know where they're going and communities are confident you actually need them, sometimes they will work with you to understand the national imperative. And the new national system operator, which was started under the Conservative government and has just been instituted under Labour, will do some of that planning. Planning is great. We're up for a bit of strategy. What we don't want them doing is the stuff the private sector does really well. And another massive achievement of the Conservative government was prioritising things like the contract for difference mechanism or competitive auctions for procuring energy generation rather than the state doing it, because that's driven down prices much faster than anyone thought was possible. So long story short, there are some things that the state does really well. There are some things they're entitled to do to direct an essential service to the economy. There are some things they're really terrible at, and I would include technology, iteration, and predictions about pricing in that. And most of all, I think if we can make this attractive for people, if we can make these technologies appealing, if we can give people services, if we can prove that we can help people with their bills, if we can make the economic case, people will come with us on climate change or net zero or whatever else we're calling it.
We could do a lot better, couldn't we, with our housing stock and helping people heat their homes. We're in the middle of a controversy over the winter fuel allowance. That should surely be part of the discussion about the net zero journey, is just better housing stock.
Yeah, absolutely right. And what people tend to forget when they talk about our housing stock is that people talk about building new homes to ever higher insulation standards. Actually, 90-something% of our built environment is stuff that's been around for decades, in some cases centuries. So you've got to have a retrofit program that turns a 19th century townhouse, a Victorian this or that, into something which is as fuel efficient as possible, because it's a great way, it's one of the most efficient ways of cutting people's energy bills. You've got to do the insulation up in front, but lots and lots of people have spent the last 10 years putting a bit of extra insulation in their loft. When a cricket ball goes through the kitchen window, replacing it with a double or a triple glaze unit, those sorts of things. That comes naturally to people because they can see the effect on their energy bills, and that's the kind of thing which just goes with the grain again, rather than having to be sort of finger wagging ordered to do things.
There's a really important energy security message about buildings which I'd like to get across as well. And in the middle of the energy crisis, when we were trying to explain to the public why their bills were going up even though we had a secure supply of gas, the answer was because we're exposed to international prices, which the UK can't really influence even as a producer. So the only thing you can do is try and reduce your gas demand, really. 50% of our imports actually go to heat. 80% of the households in the UK have individual gas boilers. That dependency is becoming an energy security risk. And we found that a very powerful argument to people that electrification might also be a way of reducing our dependence on not always friendly countries which control the gas prices that we import.
People will buy that, but the thing that will really persuade them is actually on the day that it becomes cheaper to install a heat
Completely
pump
agree.
than a new gas boiler. When my gas boiler conks out, if it's cheaper to put it, at that point we win, and it goes with the grain and everybody does it because it makes sense to them. That's where we need to get to.
Try putting a heat pump in a small terraced house in
at the moment we are not
place
there.
in Leeds.
No.
That's impossible.
Yeah.
We are just not there yet.
It does seem sometimes like a bit of a middle class, electric cars, heat pumps, all very well for people who live in nice large houses with driveways or infrastructure, charging infrastructure around them. That leaves a huge number of people behind.
Violently agree that we need to spend at least the next 5 years, probably the next 10 years, working out how to do this transition in a way that the public also think is fair. When we poll people, cost obviously comes up, but when you bury into the detail, often it's this idea of fairness. Who gets these technologies? Who benefits from them? How fast will I benefit? Is that fair across society? And I completely agree that we've got to get the cost of electricity down. A lot of that is regulatory again.
It is, but also people are inventing better heat pumps all the time. They're using different kinds of gas in them, all these other things. So the cost of both installing them and then how well they work is getting better all the time. So the faster that the private sector can come up with better bits of kit, so that we get to the point where we all want to do it because it's just cheaper for us, then the argument is won. It's easy at that point. That's where we need to get to.
We may have just breathed new life into the net zero conversation. Emma really got quite emotional when she was talking about her 2-year-old son and what he thought about pylons going across the country. I think sometimes what the Conservatives miss in this conversation is that lots of older people, many of whom vote Conservative, are very concerned about their children and about their grandchildren and the kind of world they may grow up in. And I think Emma just brought that across in that conversation. And if you're watching this podcast, you will have seen that in the background was a nice big red tractor, because everyone loves a tractor. The fact it was there is because we recorded that bit of this podcast at the Conservative Party conference. And that was actually the stand for the National Farmers Union. And not wanting to look a gift tractor in the mouth, we thought, well, we should really interview the president of the NFU, because landowners and the people who farm the land are one of the most important custodians of what that land looks like and how we use that land and how we produce food. So I caught up with the president of the NFU, Tom Bradshaw, and I asked him about what role farmers had in this vital conversation. Tom Bradshaw, NFU president, we're having a discussion for our audience about the net zero debate, which has become very toxic for people. And we have a little bit of a thesis. If we could imagine a different type of story about net zero, maybe we could get rid of some of this left versus right argument. It's always become part of a kind of culture war. If you agree or disagree with net zero or climate change, it puts you on a side of the political fence. One thought I had, and it's lovely that we bumped into each other at the Conservative Party conference, was there is a quiet environmentalism abroad in Britain about people who take care of our green and pleasant land. And that is under risk that is at risk because of climate change. Just wonder, Tom, what's your sense of the role of farmers and our landowners in protecting that green and pleasant land?
Yeah, I think you hit on a point there. For my members, the climate change, I still believe, is one of our biggest risks. We've seen over the past few years the extremes of weather that we're having, and this last 12 months, even the last 2 weeks, has been incredibly challenging. Huge volumes of rain, and those extremes, the volatility we're seeing is quite incredible. So we're on the forefront of climate change and how we deal with it. But I think, again, what you're saying is that the debate has become too sort of divided. And it's become driven by ideology rather than science and evidence. And our members are very, very well placed to actually deliver climate change mitigation, but we've got to underpin that with proper science and evidence. How much carbon can the soil sequester? What systems actually do deliver that carbon sequestration? And also this out of sight, out of mind attitude that if we stop production here and we produce it somewhere else in the world, that suddenly solves the problem. I mean, that is absolutely lunatism.
What can our farming community do to help mitigate the effects of what you're already seeing in your day-to-day lives?
So I always divide this into two areas. One is the production side of food. We need to aim to be in the top quartile globally. If I look at our dairy industry, if I look at our red meat industry, we're in that top upper quartile. We're doing really well, producing that milk and meat efficiently. So that gives us permission to produce. Then on the other side, how do we mitigate the carbon emissions? So producing food for 9.5 billion people on this planet is always going to have an impact. But how do we mitigate that? Is it by planting trees? Is it by sequestering more carbon in our soils? Is it hedgerows? Is it a combination of them all? How do we drive the circular economy so that we're recycling the manure and the nutrients and human waste as well, and reapplying that to the land and reducing our artificial fertilizer use? So it's not all about reducing production, or it's not at all about reducing production. It's how we produce smarter, but also how we really recycle all of those nutrients and have a truly systemic approach.
Are you a farmer?
Yes.
Tell me about your farm and just give us an example. What was wonderful, we just spoke to Emma, who's head of the UK Energy Trade Body, and she spoke about her son and her son actually liking pylons because he's been brought up to sort of understand they're a necessary part of a kind of safer future. Let me just put it like that.
Don't start me on
pylons. It was
pylons.
lovely. I won't start you on pylons just yet, although I may come to you on pylons. Just tell me what you do on your farm that people can really understand. I feel that sometimes this whole net zero debate is confused by just big numbers and very top-down direction. But give us a story about your farm.
So our family farm is only 162 acres, which in the scale of farming is relatively small. We then farm land for other people as well. But on our home farm, I'm the fourth generation in North Essex, Colchester, North Essex. But we've got 50 kilowatts of solar panels on the roofs of our buildings. We fitted that in 2011. That's offsetting a large amount of carbon emissions because it's rooftop. It's not taking any land out of production, but it's a small part of the solution. And we've got rooftops right the way across the country that could be and should be fitted with solar panels. But instead, we're seeing these mass conglomerations of solar panels on fields that are often taking some good agricultural land out of production. Now, we believe in the energy transition, but the best and most versatile agricultural land must be maintained for food production. Otherwise, we're going to be food insecure, but we might have energy.
And also very, very ugly.
Look, we have to move slightly beyond this. In that, what I don't want to do is, I might think pylons are ugly, but you're going to tell me they're a necessity. But a lot of people don't like the look of solar panels, and I do genuinely believe they should be on industrial roofs, they should be on farm roofs. There's also a place for ground-mounted solar, but it shouldn't be on the best and most versatile land, and it shouldn't be on land that's farmed by tenants, because those tenants don't stand to benefit in any way, and it would have a huge impact on their businesses.
Do you think the British public will agree to lots more pylons striding across the hills and fields of the UK and lots more wind farms striding across the hills and fields of the UK?
So I'm not sure the British public are going to have a choice, actually. When you hear what's been said, very strident views coming out of the government, you've got to get on with this. And look, some of that, whether it's right or wrong for our members, we are the ones that host those pylons. I have to declare an interest. They're coming through my farm. So, that's going to have a real impact on our vista. So that's something.
Will you get some economic benefit, I hope?
Very, very little. Yeah, very little. But that's going to have an impact. But I think what we have to look at is, what do we want the energy system to look like? where there is an alternative, we've been arguing for an offshore ring main for probably the last 6 or 7 years, that these wind farms offshore should connect into and off the land, and then bring that round to Tilbury, which is where we need the energy at the moment. And those developments haven't ever gained any sort of attention or seem to be the correct approach. But we do need to mitigate the impact of this huge national infrastructure.
Tom, thank you so much for your time, and good to see the tractor in our background here.
I know,
everyone loves a tractor.
It's bringing the farming to the city.
That was Tom Bradshaw, and of course many rural voters also vote Conservative. I hope you've enjoyed this edition of the Daily Tea. We were trying to do something a little bit different. We were taking head on Jacob Rees-Mogg's very, very coherent and cogent argument about why he so disliked the net zero debate, but also leaning into so many people, so many of the public, so many voters, so many Conservative supporters actually want something to happen in net zero, and we've tried to see if there's a different type of argument, which our 3 guests on this podcast, I think, have made a really good effort at doing. We'd love to hear your points of view on this very contentious issue. Do write to us, email us at thedailytea@telegraph.co.uk. Do comment on our socials as well. The address is in the show notes. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m, with the Daily Tea.